So again, for today, I'd like to introduce, again, typically backed by popular demand and recommendation is Graham Furnis. Today on Thought Rock Live, Graham will be talking about service transition, testing, validation, and evaluation. What's the difference? And I think he'll the tie-in with folks that are in change. I think we've introduced Graham a few times. We always have a short introduction in terms of who Graham is. He's fully immersed and passionate in providing ITSM solutions. He's a business-driven IT professional with 20-plus years of technology and management experience. Graham is certified as an ITIL manager and expert, as well as an accredited ITIL instructor. So with that, I will turn it over to Graham.
Great. Well, thank you, Rick, and welcome everyone in Thought Rock. So our topic today, testing, evaluation, and validation, terms which typically don't get talked about too much, and we just want to try and clarify those things, and I'll give you my perspective on how I differentiate and lay those pieces out. And it's Valentine's Day, so I don't know if I can tie testing and evaluation and so on into that, but I will make a reminder. Hopefully everyone's having a good start to the day. So well, let's get into the presentation. I'll try and keep to our schedule, and we'll sort of get through the main content by 12:30. But here's the basic agenda that we're going to cover today. Always good to know exactly where we sit in the ITIL life cycle. So we'll review the service life cycle and pick up the processes that deal with those terms, and also understand a little bit about how they relate throughout the rest of the life cycle. So once we know where we are, we can go back, and I always like to clarify my terminology and define a bit more about the process goals involved. And then we can take a look at the activities and try and sequence where they might fall into place to get a better understanding of them. There's a service V model. It used to be a long time ago that was discussed back in the early foundation courses for version 3. And I find it incredibly useful to talk about, and I'm going to bring it back up today. And then we'll also go back and we'll integrate this with change and release and deployment because it's part of the key concepts which brings these terms to life. And then we'll wrap it up with questions and any comments you might have at the end. And hopefully today, I'll give you my interpretation and a delivery about how I see these terms and processes fitting together. And hopefully that sparks a bit of thoughtfulness on your part and some questions, and you can share them with the group as we move through. Okay. So let's get into part 1, which is looking at the service life cycle and figuring out where these terms exist. Okay, so here's my service life cycle diagram and all the processes and the 4 functions in the bottom corner. So I have a little box that's just come up, and so right here, this is where the specific process areas exist for testing and validation and evaluation. So, so a little question before I move beyond this slide, and Rick, I'll just pass it to you and get everyone kind of thinking. So if you look at what I've got circled there, we've got validation and testing and change evaluation as process areas. Do you think those are areas that by themselves should be defined processes in an organization with nothing else around it? Would you ever just start off in an ITIL, let's say we're adopting ITIL, would you ever just start off with validation and testing as being the first process areas?
I don't think so. I don't necessarily see the value in doing that, so I'm going to say no.
I would agree. And you went in the right direction for what I'm going to do with the rest of this slide. All of these process areas, they all support, service delivery and services in our service catalog. But some processes and process areas are more supportive. And in the way that I approach and think about validation, testing, and evaluation, by themselves, they don't have a specific reason to exist as a standalone entity. So in terms of going through and highlighting a few other pieces of the service life cycle, the real reason for existing comes from the top. We have a transition that's happening. We have 3 different processes that deal with managing the transition as a change and doing the release and development work, the really complicated things handled by transition planning and support. And one of the things we want to make sure we do throughout the transition phase of the life cycle, produce transitions that meet the initial requirements and specifications, and when they get rolled out and deployed, they don't cause incidents and failures elsewhere in the IT infrastructure. So transition needs to have a good QA type of activity, and again, that QA activity, being validation, testing, and evaluation, is in support of a transition that's going through. So we don't just randomly go out and start testing things, although you might have a policy that would do that for certain reasons. But we're doing it in relation to some type of transition moving through the life cycle. So while this diagram's up, a couple of other things I can kind of highlight that also give meaning and relationship integration, if you want to think of it, to these terms. So over on the design side of the life cycle, I've only circled the first 2, but design, coordination, and service level management. These are 2 critical areas, which I'll talk about a bit more as I go through and discuss the terms. But you know, when we start designing a service and we start coming up with the warranty requirements and we start putting them into service level agreements, before we roll them out into the production environment, we should probably go through the testing and validation and evaluation concepts to make sure that we're truly doing what we agreed to do and that we can achieve those targets. So again, you know, it needs to be integrated. That gives a bit more of a scope definition to what's going to be taking place in our validation and testing processes and evaluation. And continuing through the life cycle a little bit, going back up into service strategy and just thinking about portfolio and business relationship management. So you know, the design side looks after the actual design and structure of our service, and then up in the more strategic side of things, we're dealing with business cases and the actual reason for what the outcomes are that we want the service to achieve, or the transition. And again, that also has an impact on our validation, testing, and evaluation concepts, because they need to validate that we're actually able to achieve not just our design requirements here, but also our strategic business requirements. And then if I add another piece to this, so with transition, you need those front-end pieces to truly know what's happening from a business and design perspective and in support of a transition. And once we roll out, we need to make sure we're doing ongoing monitoring, and you know, it's part of the overall transition that once things are in production, you can do a lot of the pre-work to make sure it's successful in the quality assurance, but you also need to keep an eye on what's happening as things are in operation. Okay, so all of these other areas have some way of having an input and bringing life to the terms of testing, validation, and change evaluation. So let's move into the next piece and try and understand a bit more about the individual terms that make up our two process areas. And here we go. So I'll start off with testing. I find most people are familiar with the testing term. It tends to be the other ones that get a lot more questions and thoughtfulness. So testing, as you can see here, I've kind of given some color to a couple of keywords. What we're trying to do with testing, we're trying to verify. And verify something. It could be a configuration item, a service, a process. You want to think more holistically that it's not just testing IT components, hardware and software. What often I find people miss, you do need to test your processes, any of the type of management systems that are out there, you need to think about all the pieces. So we need to verify those things. And the way we verify them is to match them against the initial specifications that were laid out during service design. So when you're running through and you're designing hardware, servers, and software that sits on the server and the client desktop, we need to go and compare it back to the actual design specifications and the business rules and say, here's what it should be doing. So we're usually pretty good at that, and everyone's pretty comfortable with the term for testing. And then we get into so what's the difference between testing and validation? Because this is a combined terminology in the process. So with validation, what we're trying to do, instead of just simply verifying against hard specifications, we're trying to ensure that those same things, the configuration item, service, or process, again, think holistically across all aspects of a service. Here we're trying to make sure they meet the needs of the business. And so business requirements really become the big thing here. So what was it initially that we were thinking about trying to achieve with this service, and how can we actually measure that? One of the concepts within design is that don't put any type of agreement or target on something if you can't measure it. So when we get finally into validation, we would have thought about this in design, and we'd be able to come up with some type of measurements to make sure that we can validate that our actual service will be able to meet the business requirements. And so, the concept here is the business case containing a lot of those high-end business requirements and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So the two key things here is that these two processes work together because the testing is, just in a terminology point of view, focused on core specifications and more numerical type of measures. And then when we get into the business requirements, these are more business-oriented outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So if we bring the two terms together, this will give me a chance to let you think about this process, the testing and validation process. So the overall purpose then, it just kind of combines those terms. It makes sure any type of new or changed service, and again, so we're talking about a transition, matches its initial design specifications done during service design, and then meets the needs of the business based on your business outcomes and business requirements. So when we do this, the terms that anyone who's been involved with ITIL are familiar with, we can make sure something is fit for purpose, meaning that it's capable of doing the functions and it's got all of the capability to do the job, and then we can assure that it's fit for use, where it's not going to have a poor availability, poor performance and throughput. It's very usable, and it'll be able to do all of those purpose type of functions in a reliable way. And overall, that provides confidence that what we've just delivered is the correct and accurate service and set of products. So testing and validation has always been typically associated with quality assurance, and it just divides those two terms. Instead of just people focusing on just testing of specifications, by bringing in the validation term, you can think higher up in the life cycle that you're going back into the strategy phase as well and thinking about the overall business case and business outcomes that we want to achieve. So let's think about how we can validate it and plan for it from the beginning. So let me do a little sequence diagram here, which should make it a bit more interesting today. So at the bottom of this next diagram, we have the 4 phases of release and deployment. So you have your initial deployment planning, then you move into the release, build, and test. Deployment, you can transfer and retire different components, and then you can review and close your release. And I'm going to put up a little set of bars here to allow me to kind of sequence some events. And Rick, just to add a bit of more life to the presentation, I'm going to ask you to kind of think about this for a minute. Where do you think the terms would start in the start gates here? Where do you think testing would fall, and where do you think validation would fall? And I'll ask at the same time too, which one do you think comes before the other, or do they happen at the same time?
Well, hopefully I get the first one right. The testing should start right at release build test, I'm assuming, at that bar. I think that would make the most sense. And
Yes, you got that
then
one.
I think validation starts towards the tail end of testing. So, right after testing, not necessarily by your diagram. I'm sure there'd be some parallel or some overlap at some point, but really at the tail end of testing.
Yeah, and my diagram's a bit different. This diagram is done just my way of giving a more simplified interpretation of how I see these terms following. So, so this is more my interpretation. I think you're right on that testing comes first, validation kind of follows. I put a bit of an overlap here, and what I've done is also I've got an initial column here. So when we start off in sequencing the activities, typically we think about testing as that here's my test cases, here's a set of components or application pieces that now I can run my test cases against, and that's what testing is. But don't forget that at the beginning you have to come up with your test plans, and this is actually done in the pure ITIL way of thinking of things back in service design. So when you start designing something, think about how you can measure it and test it back then. So not to confuse it though, the main activity of testing, once you get your components, then you can go ahead here and start doing the testing activity. So then we get to this little bar that I've put up here, or hurdle. So once you go from test to deployment, okay, we're now starting to put things into the live environment. And you notice here I put in a second bar halfway through the deployment before the review and close. So quite often, certainly the way I promote doing a lot of things in IT, it's always good to break down your deployments, especially the more complicated you get. But break it into phases, break it into, I mean, there's so much talk in the ITIL books and in practice and doing pilots and other ways of doing small tests. So you may continue your testing into the live environment, just validating that everything up until this line here again is done in a test environment, and then you start rolling it out into the production environment. You can still repeat those tests to make sure they're valid. So I think there's a good argument to be said that your testing doesn't stop dead as soon as you move to the live environment. You certainly want to do it all as thoroughly as possible to make sure that you have working components, and then it starts moving into the live environment. Now when we get down to the validation little arrow down here, so I've sequenced this one to begin. Once something moves from the test environment into more of a live environment. So it's probably accurate enough to think about it that way, although you might have an argument to say, well, you can start doing your validation plans and activities during the test environment. But really, to really know how things are starting to work from a business perspective and from our outcomes and objectives, I put it here when things start to be deployed with the concept that if you have a pilot group, then that pilot group can truly validate that, yes, we have all of the working components that testing has shown are working successfully, but now we need to validate that we're actually rolling or achieving our business objectives. We're able to use it like we had planned, and it's achieving the benefits that we had hoped to in the live environment. So this is the way I'm kind of presenting the concepts of validation and testing and allowing you to get a sort of your mind around it. And it's just my interpretation of where it should begin. And you'll see here that it goes all the way through to pretty much when we review and close the release. Right? So there can be an ongoing set of validation and monitoring after the fact. So this kind of explains a little bit about the testing and validation concepts. And then we have one more, though. We have to fit somewhere the evaluation concept. So the next piece of the presentation is this slide here. So let's define our term for evaluation, and then let's take a look at the evaluation process. So evaluation itself, it's a formal assessment of a transition. And what we're trying to ensure is that the risks have been managed in order to help determine whether we authorize the change. So this tells you two things. Number one, this process is very much more subjective and trying to look larger scope. We're trying to assess the overall transition, and we're trying to understand the risk environment. So did we just introduce something which may work by itself, but maybe in combination with the rest of the environment, maybe introducing a risk? And it's related to the change process here because it's an independent way of going through and saying, yes, this transition should be authorized to be accepted and closed. So let's go into a bit more definition into our overall purpose. So what we're actually trying to do here, we're trying to assess the overall service change, and we're trying to compare actual versus predicted performance. So we know what it should be doing. We know how it should be behaving in our operational environment. And let's go ahead and start understanding what's exactly happening by this new transition. So we've got the actual testing and validation pieces that have tested the specifications and tested the business outcomes. What we're trying to find here, and I always find these are good words, unintended and intended effects of the service change. So what you're trying to look for, it's, again, a lot of ways you can think of this as being observational and sort of exploratory, is looking around to say, what's happening to the overall IT infrastructure. And that's here in the next bullet point. This gives you an idea that when we're dealing with all of our testing and validation activities, we're focused on the service. And when we get into evaluation, we're still focused on the service, but now we're thinking more about the wider scope issue, what's happening with our IT infrastructure. So if we have this evaluation piece added on to our testing and validation, then this supports the overall authorization of our changes. So I've mentioned change a few times in the description of both the definition and the process for evaluation. And you'll notice that the process is called change evaluation. So I think we need to just do a quick little recap of our change types and definitions. And we can think, too, about trying to put the terms together with the change concepts. So in this next slide, I have the four basic service change types. And I'm really only going to discuss 3 of them to keep it simple for now. But when we come down to evaluation, evaluation is doing something where we're really trying to look at the wider scope issues of some type of transition. So I'll just put the first letters up here. But here's where we might consider, for major changes, we might want to consider having a formal evaluation done to make sure that these things have gone into the live environment and aren't producing any type of unusual or unintended or unexpected negative effects. Now, should we do evaluation? Yeah.
Graham, I got a quick question, just because I want to make sure we maybe address this before you go that much further. There was actually a number of questions that just kind of popped up in the last 4 minutes. Is it okay if I just stop you here? You might have to reverse back on a couple slides, but can we answer those questions?
I love questions.
Okay, great. First question is, and it's actually there's 2 questions in a row that I'll ask, and then I'll ask the last one. and it must be related to a couple slides back, but would this, it's from Guy, would this be for COTS software or homegrown software? So would this be for COTS software or homegrown software, and wouldn't you want a box for QoS and security of application?
Is that in reference to the evaluation piece, or?
I believe so. It was back at about 6 minutes ago when it came in, when the question came in. So I'll actually ask for clarification if you want to move forward. And then there's another question that came in. It was actually 3 slides back, Graham. So 3 slides back.
Well, 3 back would have been, I had the sequencing slide. And then before that was just the definition of testing and validation.
Mm-hmm. So maybe if there's anything else, this is a slide here. It's a sequencing activity. So I apologize if it's Guy or Guy. I know people go by both. I'm French Canadian, so all my relatives are Guy. Some people go by Guy. If you want to if there's any further clarification, maybe what we'll do then is move forward and have you address it right at the end. Is that okay, Graham?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so going back to the change types and how I'm trying to lay the terms out, and again, I'm giving you my interpretation of how I see these on top of just the raw notes and stuff. So evaluation, this is when we're dealing with a major change. This is how I look at the two things. And we need to go the extra step to make sure that we're looking at the live environment, making sure we've done nothing to damage the overall efficiency or effectiveness of our operating environment. So then when it comes down to validation, normal changes, and I'm just putting one letter here. These are all, in my mind, cumulative. So normal changes should be validated based upon what level or priority of impact, what level of impact is the normal change affecting, but here's where we start bringing in the validation to make sure we're meeting business outcomes. And at a lower level of those normal changes, some just require testing because they don't really affect or change, perhaps, business outcomes. So as you kind of move up your impact levels, then you're going to start adding in the concepts. So we can always test. You can always test individual components against basic specifications, and that should be done for pretty much every change. I can't imagine anything, well, there's always something that doesn't get tested, but you can always do a basic test. The validation goes a little step further, trying to test things at a higher level, and then of course evaluation takes it an extra step and an extra amount of time and effort in order to make sure we're truly testing or confirming that our transition hasn't just rolled out successfully, but is sitting in the live environment successfully. So if we bring it all together, I'll go back to our diagram here. So we have our testing and validation arrows, and there's a little space at the bottom. And I'll bring it back to Rick. So Rick, where do you think evaluation would sequence in the grand scheme of it here?
I would assume it starts somewhere during or in parallel to validation. Given that I'm assuming it has a broader scope to it.
Yeah, and I would say you could actually, as soon as you start deploying something, you can truly start doing these evaluation type activities to start looking at the effect on the rest of the IT environment, especially if you're doing things in a pilot or more of a phased approach. You can try and look at the local infrastructure that is related to each of these deployments. And again, this is my sort of way of trying to get a quick high-level view of the whole thing. You can certainly start your evaluation activities even back in your testing phase, and of course everything is planned back in service design. But it's a quick way of just kind of getting a good sense of it. You want to test things definitely before they hit the production environment, and then you might continue those tests or repeat the same ones into the early deployment stages, just to make sure that what we're doing is in fact successful. We can start validating that our business outcomes are actually starting to happen the way that we initially had thought about back in our overall business cases. And then, again, the evaluation, we're looking for both predicted and unpredicted impact and events and performance, so we can start looking at the wider implications of a major service change by adding in that extra evaluation piece. So the key about evaluation is it's just like the overall concept throughout ITIL. Not every change is the same because we have different types of changes. Not every service is the same because it has different types of impact. So evaluation is needed when you have that more risky and large impacting type of service and transition. Otherwise, you can scale it back a bit. And I mentioned about scaling because in the business world, you can't test everything at the same degree and to 100% unless it has the same degree of impact, because there simply isn't the budget and the time and effort to do all that.
And Graham, there's a comment here. In release build test, you want to make sure that software has passed vulnerabilities testing, especially if you're putting it up on the web. Security awareness in ITIL is a must. Anything around that comment that you want to come back with?
Oh, yeah. I'm not trying to play down the testing. 100%, you don't cross this line here until you've done a thorough amount of testing, appropriate to whatever type of transition you're doing. And if you're putting something out on the web, well, that's a business-facing, customer-facing deployment. So, typically in your impact models, that's going to be one of your highest impacts, if not the highest impact. So you're going to go through every degree of testing. You've got your security testing. I mean, testing is not small. Anyone who's been involved in that field, it's massive. And you want to make sure everything's been checked and so on before you move into the next phase. And even the validation. The higher the impact, you can probably back these stages up back into the test environment. But then eventually you've got to get the rubber on the road, and you're going to have to start deploying. And again, that's where you need to still go through and say, just because we've tested ahead of time and everything has passed and looks like it should work, don't assume it will. Make the assumption it won't, and then you have to have a policy to figure out, well, how much further do I go? I need to do the formal validation, evaluation, continue, like I say, your testing, do the same test again in the live environment. But in terms of, at least, pictorially, it kind of lets you think about, I need to think about a policy of these things because it makes sense. You want to definitely have that ongoing evaluation when there's a major type of change going through.
And Graham, another question here. Can you give us an example of an unexpected outcome? The expected outcome, I guess, would be in the test plans.
Yeah, the unexpected outcome, and this is what evaluation really wants to look for. So we have a new application sitting on people's desktops, and we've run all of our tests, and everything looks fine. And then suddenly, maybe a week or 2 weeks down the road, could be a month down the road, desktop performance starts to deteriorate. When two different applications are running. And so in our test cases, we never thought about, let's just say we have one type of scheduling system, and then we have another application running for some type of client service application, and they're starting to conflict with each other, or maybe they're, in some way not totally compatible in ways we aren't sure of. So that's the whole concept of the unexpected change. Quite often you can't think of all the scenarios, even though you might have all that software you've tested and you've done an integration test ahead of time. When you actually get things out to the production environment, don't underestimate how things can happen which you just didn't expect. So that's what an unexpected event is, or unexpected performance. Something to the negative. I mean, if something is positive, that's a good thing. But evaluation wants to protect against the negative risk. So we're trying to find anything unusual where suddenly people are reporting, slowdown in performance. Maybe it's even something where end users are confused by maybe a conflict between two different programs and just using it, right? Evaluation is looking for both technical and non-technical type of negative risks. So if suddenly I have a whole bunch of users who are making data entry errors because something isn't very clear, evaluation wants to pick that up. So that's the concept. Again, evaluation wants to just pick up anything that's not working the way it should do and is not producing positive impact the way it should do. We're looking across processes, people, technology, all of those areas. Okay, now I have only 2 slides left, and I'll just quickly go through them. So I mentioned before about a service V model, and the service V model I always find is a good one just to kind of bring some of these terms together. So here it is. I've broken it out from the normal ITIL diagrams. So with the service V model, there's first of all 2 halves. There's left and right. On the left side of the model over here, this is where we go through the front end of a transition, and we gather the business requirements, we gather service requirements, we do the service solution design, the release design, down here to the overall development activity. So, just a quick question. When it comes to business requirements and service requirements, Rick, where do you think, in terms of the life cycle stage, where do you think we pick those up from?
Probably strategy and design.
Yeah, and so the service V model is a good one because it kind of gives an integrated view, or another way of viewing across the service life cycle. So if I jump back to our life cycle diagram for a minute, so our business requirements in that service V model come from right here. Service portfolio and business relationship management. That's where we come up with the business outcomes we need to achieve and the reason for having a service or a transition in the first place. Then we have to translate those business requirements into more design specification type requirements, and that's what our service design life cycle phase is doing. And then we need to take those design specifications and we need to start actually coming up with the hardware and software plans, and that's where release and deployment is going to pick up the ball. So if I go back to our diagram then, so you're really running down from strategy through design, through transition, and in the release and deployment process. You can actually start doing down here the individual component build or the acquire. And because you've designed things on this side, when you're designing it, you're going to come up with your test cases and whatever validation plans on the other. So when you come up with the individual components, when they start coming back out, you can test them against the plan on the left. Once you start putting those components together into release packages, you can test it against the release design over on the left. Then we get to the service operational readiness test, where we can test the overall service solution. And I won't get into too much detail here, but there's a lot been that I've come across in terms of service operational readiness frameworks and even separate service operational readiness processes out there. So a lot of time and effort goes in here because we're looking at now more of a larger scope. Not just hardware and software components, but we're looking at the processes and the management systems. We're trying to make sure that before we roll things out, I've got all of my ducks lined up and tested. So then we get into the service acceptance test, and it balances against, on the left, the overall service requirements. So here's where I go through the SLAs and make sure we're meeting that test criteria. And then we get to the validation up here, where you can validate the service packages and make sure we're coming or truly achieving the business outcomes. So a really good diagram, because for every time you go through a design activity on the left, you should be thinking about how do I measure it and how do I test for it on the right-hand side. And the bigger the scope of your change, the more you move up from the bottom to the top level. Again, very simple things that don't have business cases or don't have any overall service delivery change. you're not going to have to do all those separate validation and high-level testing activities. You might just be doing a component change, and you just do your testing down at that bottom level. So the only thing that they don't show on the diagram, I don't know, do you notice any terms, Rick, that are missing from that diagram that we've covered today?
You may have caught me on that one, Graham. I'm not sure.
Well, we've covered 3 terms: testing, validation, and evaluation. So you'll see over on the right-hand side lots of testing, and then we got validation at the top. The only thing the diagram doesn't have, and I wouldn't say it's an error, but it's one thing I could conceptually add in there, is the evaluation step. It might be one step higher in this model because we want to go back and evaluate beyond the business requirements to make sure the overall environment is operationally sound. So when they bring up the discussion of this V model within the ITIL books, I'm pretty sure everywhere I've found it is within the release and deployment section, and also within the testing and validation section. But I think there could be an argument made to expand the diagram just one or 2 levels higher for evaluation. Okay, so the last...
Graham, just one more question here too is, so how do you score the service portfolio with the business portfolio to validate that you're getting the highest degree of business service?
Well, in terms of the degree of testing and confirmation of your service delivery, is that what the question is?
Not sure. Maybe you can confirm a little bit more. Yeah, all we've got here is, so how do you score the service portfolio with the business portfolio to validate that you're getting the highest degree? So how do you score the service V model that those business apps are prioritized?
Yeah, it's on, well actually I can probably go, let me go down to the next slide. So it's related to the change process. So for every transition you're doing, and going back into that service V model, every change is going to be assessed for impact on the live environment. So whatever your impact tables are, I mean, this is going to be agreed upon within your overall ITIL structure and both your service and your business portfolios. So if your transition is coming through and it's impact 1, it's affecting the customers in the live environment, and going back up a step, then you want to have all 5 levels of testing and validation done in the service V model. And then if it is an impact 1 and it's a major change by category and definition, you'll add on top of that the layer of evaluation. Then as your impacts come down in your portfolio, depending upon what it's touching and how it's interfacing with the end customer, then you can scale down the service V model. Right? So your lower impact areas might be just down here if you're just dealing with minor low impact component changes. And then as you move up, sorry, my diagram's getting messy, but as you move up in that impact, you're gonna have more requirements, more testing, more test cases, and you need to go slower because you have a higher risk of failure. So the last piece I have then, again, change is driving this, and it's driving your change process. It's driving your testing, validation, and evaluation activities, because change is the one that sets up the impact level and the overall risk assessment for the change. And then you have to have a policy that says, based upon this type of impact and risk category, here's how the degree and level of testing I'll do. So if I sort of integrate a few things here, so the way I've done this diagram, so here's our change process. When we're going through and we're assessing and evaluating the change, here's where we may trigger release and deployment management to start thinking about, well, let's come up with our release and deployment plans, and that will allow change and the CAB or whatever level of authorization to go through and make an assessment. You get the authorization to go ahead, so now release and deployment can go ahead and start doing the release, build, and test. And then here I'll bring in the testing arrow. So we need to complete our testing, and this needs to come back into change management because they're not going to authorize deployment until we see those test results. So once we get the authorization for that, release can go ahead and start doing the deployment. They can then start doing the validation activity if that's the way we're going to sequence it. The results of the validation activity may go back here and may come back in here to the change process to allow us to finish our release activities and start closing our change. If it's a major change and we have that additional activity, then we might say we aren't going to close the major change until we have our final report and confirmation from the evaluation process. So again, here's another way that my interpretation of how I look at testing, validation, and evaluation. So I'm using testing and validation within my release release activities to make sure I can confirm my release did what it was supposed to do and is successful. And when it's classified as being a major type of release and a major type of change, I'm going to have a separate evaluation process, which will give the ultimate closure for change to say we're successful. We may have ongoing monitoring for about 2 or 3 months. That may be how long evaluation goes on. But when evaluation says we can accept the change, we give a recommendation. Change management will look at the reports, and then they'll close the change record. Okay, so my quick little half hour has turned into 15 minutes, but that's because there's so much here, right? And hopefully the presentation, this is where I'll end it today. Hopefully the presentation is just giving you a way of thinking about these terms and thinking about the need for a scale to know how much of a degree of testing, validation, and evaluation should go on. Okay, so let me go down to my questions slide. And Rick, did any further questions or comments come in?
No other questions. One thing that just came in again, great job, Graham. So then you were saying you want to ITIL change process to guarantee SLA.
Yeah, so you cut out for a second there, but I think you said you want the ITIL change process to guarantee or qualify
to guarantee SLA.
Yep. Yeah, essentially, the higher the impact of the change and the overall transition, then the more it's up to the change process to drive all of the acceptance. And therefore, it's validating and guaranteeing the SLA.
Okay, great. No other questions right now, and I think what we'll do is wrap up because we're at 12:51 here. And again, thank everyone today. And again, Graham, thank you very much. And remind everyone that next week there will be a break from Thought Rock Live. We'll be returning on February 28th with a panel discussion. And again, look for your Thought Rock newsletter to give you more details on that. But again, it's a panel discussion with respect to ITIL and ITIL buy-in using a real case study and a real client that will be actually talking specifically to what the issues were. Lisa Lemons, who's a change release configuration management coordinator with Presbyterian Health Services, as well as a number of other panel members. So please join us for February 28th. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Graham, if there are any other questions, we'll make sure they get forwarded to you. If they come to us through the Thought Rock network, this presentation will be available in Thought Rock at minimum within the next 24 hours and usually fairly quickly and fairly right away. So again, thank you everyone, and hopefully we see you back on Thought Rock Live. Graham, anything final you wanted to add or say?
No, I think it is. I had a good time today kind of laying out the terms and jumping around the graphics. So hopefully everyone picked up a lot, and look forward to seeing everyone again in 2 weeks.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.